Chapter 12 of The Harbor of Doubt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Harbor of Doubt by Frank Williams. Chapter 12. Out of Freekirk Head. "Oh, I wouldn't think of such a thing for a minute." Captain Bijonah Turner waved his hand with an air of finality and favored his daughter with a glare meant to be pregnant with parental authority. "But, father, listen to reason," cried Nellie. "Here is a mother to take care of the 3 small children, and here am I with nothing whatever to do. Be sensible and let me go along. I certainly ought to be able to help in some way." "But," expostulated the captain, "girls don't go on fishing trips." "Suppose the cook should fall sick or be hurt, then I would come in handy, wouldn't I? But all this is not the real point. Things are different with us than they have ever been before. We have no home, and mother and the children have to board with Ma Sprague. If I stayed here I should be a burden, and I couldn't stand that." Bijonah scratched his head and looked at the girl helplessly. He had yet to score his first victory over her in an argument. "Have you asked your mother?" he queried at last, seeking his time-worn refuge. "Yes," said she, brightening at the imminence of victory, "and she says she thinks it'll be just the thing." "All right," said Bijonah weakly. "Come along, then. But mind, you'll find things different. Your mother is boss of any land she puts her foot on, but once I get the Rosan past Swallowtail, my word goes." "All right, Daddy dear," laughed the girl. "I know you'll be just the finest captain I ever sailed with." She kissed him impulsively and ran upstairs to tell her mother the good news. The departure of the fleet from Grande Mignon was a sad day in the history of the island. The sun had hardly shone red and dripping from the sea when all the inhabitants were astir. Men from as far south as Seal Cove and Great Harbor clattered up the King's Road in rickety vehicles, accompanied by their families and their dunnage. In Freekirk Head alone less than 10 men would be left ashore. Of these, one was Bill Boughton, the storekeeper, who was to arrange for the disposal of the catch, but the others were either incapacitated, sick, or old. The 5 aged fishermen, who subsisted on the charity of the town, formed a delegation on one string piece to wave the fleet farewell. Altogether there were 15 boats, 10 schooners and 5 sloops, carrying in all more than 125 men. The whole resource of the island had been expended to provide tubs of bait and barrels of salt enough for all these, let alone the provisions. The men either shipped on shares or, if they were fearful of chance, at a fixed monthly wage, and all found, to be paid after the proceeds of the voyage were realized. There was not a cent of Grande Mignon credit left in the world, and there was no child too small to realize that on the outcome of this venture hung the fate and future of the island. It was a brilliant day, with a glorious blue sky overhead and a bracing breeze out of the east. Just beyond Long Island a low stratum of miasmic gray was the only shred of the usual fog to be seen on the whole horizon. In the little roadstead the vessels, black-hulled or white, rode eagerly and gracefully at their moorings, the bright sun bringing out the red, yellow, green, blue, and brown of the dories nested amidships. At 7 o'clock the steamer Grande Mignon blew a great blast of her whistle, cast off her lines, and cleared for St. Andrew's and St. Stephen's. Tooting a long last salute, she rolled out into Fundy and out of sight around the point. For these men breakfast was long past, but there were the myriad last details that could not be left undone, and it was fully 8 o'clock before the last dory was swung aboard and the last barrel stowed. Then there came the clicking of many windlasses and the strain of many ropes, and to the women and girls who lined the shore these noises were as the beatings of the executioner's hand upon the cell door of a condemned man. For the first time they seemed to realize what was about to happen. The young girls and the brides wept, but those with children at their skirts looked stonily to the vessel that bore their loved ones. For they were hardened in the fear of death and bereavement, and had become fatalists. The old women shook their heads, and if tears rolled down their faces, they were the tears of dotage, and were shed perhaps for the swift and fleeting beauty of brides under the strain of their first long separation. Of these last, one stood apart, a shawl over her gray hair and her hands folded as though obedient to a will greater than her own. In all the color and pageant of departure, May Schofield wondered where her son might be, the son whom she felt had run away from his just responsibilities. 2 nights ago he had gone, and since that time the little cottage had seemed worse than deserted. Somehow the story of the solicitor and his visit went swiftly around the village, and since that time Code's mother had been the shrinking object of a host of polite, but evidently pointed inquiries. To most of these there was really no adequate reply, and the good woman had grown more hurt and more shrinking with every hour of the day. Now, with little orphan Josie at her side, she came out to see the departure of the fleet. Suddenly there came the squeaking of blocks and the rattle and scrape of rings as foresails were rushed up at peak and throat. Headsails raced into position, and with the anchors cat-headed. The vessels, with their captains at the wheels or tillers, swung into the wind and began to crawl ahead. Behind them, as they forged toward the passage, lay the great scimitar of stony beach 1/2 mile long. Beyond it were the white, contented-looking cottages built along the road, and back of all rose the vivid green mountains, covered with pine, tamarack, and silver birch, above whose tops at the line of the summit there appeared 3 terrific, puffy thunderheads. As they moved toward Flag Point, the gaily colored crowds moved with them past the post office, the stores, the burned wharfs, and the fish stands. Captain Bijonah Tanner, by right of seniority, led the way in the Roseanne as commodore of the fleet. He stood to his tiller like a graven image, looking neither to right nor left, but gripping his pipe with all the strength of his remaining teeth. He hoped that his triumph would not be lost upon his wife. Nor was it, for it was a month afterward before the neighbors ceased to hear how her Bige was the best captain that ever sailed out of Freekirk Head. At Swallowtail, Bijonah rounded the point, gave one majestic wave of his hat in farewell, and put the Roseanne over on the starboard tack, for the course was southeast, and followed practically the wake of Code Schofield. One after another the schooners and sloops, closely bunched, came about as smartly as their crews could bring them, and the smartest of them all was Nat Burns's Nettie B. Nellie Tanner, jealous for her father's prestige, could not but admire the splendid discipline and tactics that whipped the Nettie about on the tack and sent her flying ahead of the Roseanne like a great sea-bird. Once Swallowtail was passed, the voyage had begun, and the lead belonged to anyone who could take it. At last the knife-like edge of Long Island shut them out completely, and seemed at the same instant to cut the last bonds and ties that had stretched from one to another as long as vision lasted. The men felt as released from a spell. One idea rushed into their minds suddenly and became an obsession. Fish. End of chapter 12. Recording by Roger Moline.